Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay, amazing. So now we have our third panel, which is Policymakers' Perspectives, and we have a pretty illustrious panel of speakers, and I'll start with David Zimmer, who's sitting right in the middle. David Zimmer is the former Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and a four-term member of the Ontario Legislature. He has the distinction of being the longest-serving minister responsible for Indigenous relations. Mr. Zimmer represented the riding of Willowdale in both the McGuinty and Wynne governments and acted as a parliamentary assistant to Attorney General Michael Bryant and Chris Bentley, as well as a parliamentary assistant to Kathleen Wynne, then Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. Mr. Zimmer served as a member of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, Standing Committee on Estimates, Standing Committee on Justice Policy, Standing Committee on General Government, and Select Committee on Elections. So, lots of committees, yeah. And then we have Anshoo Kamal, who's seated there, and Anshoo Kamal is the Director for Policy Alignment and Intergovernmental Affairs at the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Prior to that, she was the Director of Strategic Policy at the Ontario Ministry of Education and the Director of Policy at the Ontario Ministry of Solicitor General. Her policy-making expertise also included time as a Senior Policy and Health Policy Advisor at the Cabinet Office of the Government of Ontario. Ms. Kamal also has a Master of Science in Health Policy from the University of Toronto. And then to her left, we have Brian Lewis, who's currently based at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. At the Munk School, Brian Lewis teaches in the Master of Public Policy and undergraduate public policy major programs. His areas of specialization include public finances, labor markets, and macroeconomics. Early in his career, Lewis worked in the Ontario Minister of Finance in progressively senior roles in the areas of economic and fiscal policy, forecasting, and analysis. He was the Chief Economist and Assistant Deputy Minister of the Office of Economic Policy in the Ontario Ministry of Finance from 2015 to 2021. In that role, he led the development of advice to the Ontario government on economic performance, forecasting, analysis, and policy. Lewis also played a leadership role on statistics, policy, and practices. He is currently the Senior Fellow with both the C.D. Howe Institute and the Munk School. Yeah. And then lastly, to my left, we have Dr. Maurice Bitran, who is a scientist, educator, public policy expert, and former public sector executive. He was the CEO and chief scientist of the Ontario Science Centre from 2014 to 2019. As an assistant deputy minister in the Ontario government, Maurice led the provincial portfolios on environmental policy, economic development policy and programs, the Premier's Jobs and Prosperity Council, and was Ontario's chief negotiator for the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union. As a native of Chile, Maurice was selected as one of the top 10 most influential Hispanic Canadians in 2012, received the Public Service Award from Life Science Ontario in 2013, and the Leadership Award from the Transformation Institute for Leadership Innovation in 2019. Okay, so let's get started with the questions. So the first question I'll pose to Brian and Maurice, how has your experience in the Ontario government influenced your approach to teaching graduate courses at the Munk School? And we'll start with Maurice.
Sure, thank you. Well, I wouldn't be teaching public policy if it wasn't for that experience, because my degree is in physics and astronomy, so I wouldn't know anything about it. So I picked up these skills the hard way by making mistakes and learning. And after 30-odd years in the Ontario government, I feel I learned enough that I can pass some of those biases along, and mostly to kind of shorten the time to get to be an effective policy analyst in a government. But it's it's a distillation of everything that I learned working in public policy in the Ontario government. And I have to say, I didn't work in public policy all the time. I started in scientific capacity, and I had no use for policy. And slowly I started to drift into it and started to understand how important it was. And when I got to the policy side, I realized all the people in policy had no use for the scientists. And so I thought, well, this is a problem, because when you need to craft policy, you need some scientific basis. So how do you get to these two sides to talk? So that's part of the effort. In my teaching at Monk, I teach a course on the role of science in public policy that seeks to create a bridge, a language, a common language, if you like, between policymakers and scientists, because I think both need to be involved in good policy making.
Okay, I guess I had the benefit, unlike Maurice, that I actually went and did what I studied. I basically did economics for my professional career in public service for the most part. But I went to public service after some time in academics. I did a couple of degrees in economics, and I spent some time as a lecturer on the faculty of a couple of departments before I decided not to become an academic, but I have a pretty good grounding in that. Then I went to do a long public service career, and it's great to be back. I really see the art of what I try to do, and what I think a lot of what we're trying to do in places like the Monk School is be the bridge between the incredible thinking and knowledge of the academic world and the real problems of today. And that's kind of the principle I try to bring to teaching the various courses. So to provide that bridge, the students need to have a good grounding, I think, in the theoretical principles and all the skills you need. You need the research skills, the quantitative reasoning skills. You need all that good stuff in order to be successful, I think, professionally. What I can add, and what I try to add, is a couple of those things that you will get as you go into professional life. So to make the classes, I hope, more interesting and relevant, try to bring in current public policy examples into the courses where they fit. Try, force fit a little bit, but maybe not too much. I'm lucky because in the courses I teach, there's always something interesting going on out there in the real world. It's not a push to find something interesting in the area of labor markets or public finance or macroeconomics to bring into the classroom. I don't have to work very hard at that. If I had to, I probably would, but I'm kind of blessed by that. It's not hard for me to come up with examples to bring into the classroom. In courses that are even like I do the undergraduate microeconomics course, for example, it's a fairly conventional microeconomics course like I taught many years ago to economics students and commerce students and so on. But what I try to do is, for every theory, try to show one pertinent, reasonably current public policy example of consumer theory, production isoquants, whatever it is. Try to bring something into the class, and I find that works really, really well. And the other side of it, what I try to bring is what students are asked to deliver. Sometimes they write finals, they do assignments. I've never assigned essays, but those kinds of things are all possible. But I try to have them deliver products like we would use in public service. What's a one-page briefing note that you would use when you're going in to brief Minister Zimmer on something really complicated, with the main points up front and the details later, if he's brave enough to ask for all the details. How do you actually, what are those products? Because they are different. They tend to be more concise. They tend to be more based on key facts. All that good stuff that you've learned is in the background for sure, but I try to have the students work on those, use those products, because those are the kinds of things that will help them succeed professionally. And I do see those products as a good way of bridging that good theoretical and empirical basis of an academic education into today's public policy world. And when you do it right, it's great.
Okay, amazing. That leads me to my second question, which is, what do you see as the most significant challenge in bridging the gap between academia and policymaking? And we'll start with you and then just kind of move towards me.
Okay, I hope no one else wants to speak. So I've seen it work well, and I've seen it not work well. And we'll feel obligated to talk about those a little bit. It takes interest, it takes effort, it takes some trust, it takes respecting some boundaries that the different parties have, it takes respecting their different needs. I saw it work well when I was a graduate student of economics. There were tight connections between the economics department at the University of Alberta and the economics-oriented ministries, Treasury, Economic Development, and so on. I, as a graduate student, did a project on research and development tax credits for the Alberta, oh my, the Alberta Ministry of Technology, Research and Telecommunications. It was supervised by Bev Dalby, one of Canada's top taxation economists. Ministry got value out of it, I got value out of it. good quality there. And later I got a job out of it too, which was great. So I thought that worked well. But it took, to make that happen, it took collaborative efforts between the deputy minister, leader, the economics department chair, and it seemed to work very well in Edmonton in the 1980s, and that was, I think, a good example. I saw partnerships between academia and practice work pretty well when I was at the Labor Ministry, which also was where Maurice spent a lot of time. One of my jobs is to transform occupational health and safety research after there was an expert advisory panel done by Tony Dean. We have somebody here who was involved in some of the implementation of that as well. In that transformation, what we did was we did make research more multi-party. So rather than research all being overseen by academic people, there was a panel that had academics and researchers on it, but it also had workplace party people. It had some labor representatives, some employer representatives. When we graded research proposals, we asked questions: are you working with actual workplace parties? Like, we tried to pulled and pushed some levers in our research program to get those people to work together well. So we had some success with that as well. And that actually went over really well with all parties involved. The researchers actually liked a stronger connection to the workplace. We weren't forcing it on them, at least not that I heard. So that worked really, really well. So I thought that was a big success. But then there's when I was chief economist, and that didn't work as well as I wanted to. When I took the job, the head of the public service, under my statistics role, said, "Brian, let's get access to data more open for people." He said, "There's a lot of really, really smart people out there. Let's get them access to our data, and they'll help us solve our problems." So off I went. Had a little bit of success engaging with people in the academic world about that, but the idea that we could just share data with them, that became really complicated. And there was a lot of impediments to that. First, you had to get, I would call it Dwayne Benjamin from the economics department of U of T, who's a very willing and helpful, supportive partner, but we never really got it there. On one hand, the people on the academic side wanted to know what data we had, wanted it cleaned, wanted it to be in good shape because they get great service from StatsCan, and we would have to do a lot of work to do that. On the government side, there were confidentiality rules that were really important, and we didn't get to the place where we'd figured out how to overcome those. There also were procurement rules, maybe more recently, but government's brought in rules where even if someone do work for free for the government, you still need ministerial approval. So it became very, very cumbersome to get this kind of work done. So I never really got that to where I wanted it to. I really feel frustrated by that. I mean, some of the partnerships with the academic community did pay off dividends, which we might get to in other questions, but there are some significant impediments there in terms of what's the win-win proposition. I think there's interest, but I wouldn't sell short the fact that there are some potentially significant obstacles to get to where I think it really, really should be in terms of providing insights on policy to the people of the country.
Myself, so I guess I can do a yes and because agree with all of you said, Brian, and maybe I'll take the policy perspective of challenges are also opportunities. So maybe picking up on the access to data, I think that continues to be an area to think about on how we could get better access to data with research and policymakers, and that partnership there, because ministries do have great administrative databases, like health has rich data sources, Office of Economic, great data sources, relative of course. My Children and Community Social Services, great client-based database on social assistance. So how can we think about using those better for research purposes, and that also feeds into our policy problems of today, and how do we make that work? Absolutely, privacy. I think we made some strides, and there are examples where you can come up with data sharing agreements, controlled access, and all these types of things. But there are trade-offs on both sides of it. So I think that's an area we continue to explore. Probably continues to have challenges, but also I think it's ripe for opportunity there. In terms of maybe challenge or opportunity, an area I would talk about is timing sometimes, right? Like, policy takes long, research takes long, and then in the policy world, when we get a timing, that window of there's the political will to do something, the timing is now, how do we move on that front? And if that stars align, and these types of partnerships, ongoing relationships sometimes is about how do we come together in those moments and those windows of opportunity. So, and I think, you could look at it as a challenge of timing. Policymakers would be like, I have this problem, what research do you have on this? And the research workers, I've been in this situation where the researchers will be like, that'll take me 3 years to get back to you. And I'll be like, no, I need it in 6 months, if you're lucky. So how do we sort of figure that out in terms of just line up timing when there is, and having those good dialogues along the way? I think the other opportunity I was thinking about, we're having, these are live conversations that happen now, is the insights. Like for me as a policymaker, we are influenced by research, we're looking at the research, but we're looking at it from a so what perspective. And that's how we have to communicate it up to our decision makers. And I think the previous presenter spoke about language, and that comes into that so what aspect of it as well. How do we make that compelling case? How do we bring that research out for those compelling points and then put that forward for decision makers? And I think this is where that collaboration between the researchers and the policymakers can be great, because that's our policymaker expertise, is that translation piece, but working with the researchers in the academia to say, draw that out, and to help us draw that out. So those are some areas I would highlight.
Is this on? Yes. Well, I want to say a few remarks about the challenges that political policy decision makers face. It's a different sort of challenge than developing the policy within the public service and think tanks and so on. Let me tell you an anecdote. Most ministers, I can think of an exception or two, but most ministers have no background in the ministry they've been assigned to. In my own case, and other cases, you get a call from the Prime Minister or the Premier and said, hello, David, we'd like you to be the Minister of, in my case, Indigenous Relations. So, well, thanks very much, there's no choice, you have to do that. The next thing that happened, 2 or 3 hours later, I was in a boardroom in the ministry with a deputy minister, an associate deputy minister, a couple of assistant deputy ministers, directors of various departments, and enormous briefing books that were running 6 and 8 inches. And there were multiple books. And Tom just gave a chuckle there. He knows exactly what I think of, because what I'm thinking of, he's been both a politician, if you will, and a policy guy. So it's a real challenge for any minister to absorb that as quickly as you have to, because when you walk out of that boardroom where you've had the big briefing, there's typically some media people waiting outside, and the first question is, well, what do you think of your new minister, and what are you going to do, and what are the challenges, and how's it going to unfold, and all of that stuff? And you don't want to appear stupid, you don't want to appear overconfident. Somehow you've got to kind of thread the needle so that you come out, and at least you haven't made a fool of yourself. I mean, I found it a real challenge. And I was trained as a lawyer, and I practiced law for many, many years, and I was used to dealing with volumes of material, and I could absorb it. But I had colleagues who just, it frightened them. They just, I can't handle that. So then the challenge becomes, well, how do you effectively brief the minister, and the minister's feeling overwhelmed? The answer there is, it's the skill set of the briefers to be able to read their audience, the minister, to get it right. And in that process of briefing the minister who's feeling overwhelmed, there has to be a trust that develops between the minister's office and the minister's political staff, the chief of staff and the advisors on the political side, and the public service folks. At some level, they have to trust each other, and that makes for a very effective relationship. Another great challenge in briefing the minister, a new minister has no background in the thing, or particularly a minister that is not used to policy development and that stuff. How do you translate policy speak, technical policy speak, to a language that can be understood by the politician? Most politicians, I would say across the country, are generalists. They have multiple backgrounds. Maybe someone's had a car dealership. Maybe someone's been a lawyer. Someone's been a medical doctor. It's the range, men and women. And so there's no real technical background in the ministries that they're expected to. So a good politician, the other challenge he faces, he or she faces, is to develop the self-confidence to constructively critique a policy proposal, or to constructively ask questions about it, to ask questions, probe in the policy without sounding stupid or pedantic, or that you're putting down the policy briefer or something. How does a successful politician breach that challenge? So those are the things I hope that we could talk about today. And when I came in and checked over everybody's background, I thought, this is the first time that I, as a politician, since I left politics, have been in a room full of public service policy advisors who may well keep my feet to the fire. Thank you.
In that note, I really want to commend you for being so upfront with the dilemma the politicians face, and having been on the other side of the briefing table so many times, understanding that I wasn't the one that had to go in question period and defend the policy in front of everybody, right? But this illustrates the difficulties of going from the cool halls of academia to the heated, places where politics takes place. But I would, at the risk of making this problem even more intractable, I think that we need to add a third element to this, which is the public or society, because all the policies are developed to serve the public. So we have academia, we have politicians, and we have society. And so what we have then is, in the size of this triangle, we have interfaces. We have an interface between academia or science and politics. We have an interface between academia and the public, interface between the politicians and the public. And this triangle runs on a field called trust. As long as the public trusts the scientists, the public trusts the politicians trust the scientists, and vice versa, the system works. And what we are faced now, and I think it's in the notes in the introduction to the symposium, is that there is no erosion of trust. There is an erosion of trust in science, in academia. There is an erosion of trust in government, in politicians. And so this is a corrosive problem that we need to address if we're going to have any hope to be able to make policies that are based on evidence, that are sound politically solutions, and they're going to have the social license to be actually effective in practice. And so I think this is the challenge that we face as policymakers, politicians, academics. And I think we need to work in these interfaces so we make them more effective. For example, I think it's on academia to be more upfront with its findings in plain language to the public, so there can be a trust and communication there. Institutions like science centers, like scientific divulgation, etc., they play in that side of the triangle. I think that politicians need to be more transparent, governments need to be more transparent to increase the trust in politicians. I think that both the science education of the public and the civic education of the public needs to increase so they can be more effective participants in the science. I think that nothing short of a dedicated effort to improve these interfaces is going to make policy development better. It's not just between academia and politicians, it's in this triangle that I've described.
Thank you for that perspective. I definitely think it's a really important one. So Brian, you gave us some examples of when collaboration between academia and policymakers worked really well. So I would love to hear from you, Anshoo, if you have some examples of that and how that led to, you know, positive or impactful policy outcomes.
Oh, sure, great question. I'll work backwards, maybe from the clearest and I guess the most recent on my mind, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, a lot of great support was thrown behind efforts, public policy efforts at the time. A lot of people reached out and offered support, and boy, did we ever take it. I ended up sitting on something called the COVID-19 modeling table, which, if you might remember from during the pandemic, there'd be these occasional updates from this committee that said, hey, here's what we think is going to happen with, you know, sort of like infection rates, essentially, going forward. I sat on that table mostly as an observer and occasionally imparting a little bit of economic or sort of communications advice as it turned out. But I felt that was incredibly successful. I think that public policy decisions were informed very well by the best science we had, and it was not the most satisfactory of science. Anybody who sat at that table would say, you know, we're doing our best with very limited data, but here's what we think it is, and here's the scenarios. And I think that was great that was done. And you know, sometimes it wasn't as right as we wanted it to be, and sometimes it was actually pretty close. So I thought that was a big success, that informed public policy. The second example I would draw is, again, during my time at the Labor Ministry, we had established a strategy and some clear priorities. And two priorities were health and safety with small businesses, because they tend to have most of the big problems and most of the fatalities, and also falls from heights. That's actually a significant source of serious injuries and fatalities. And since I was relatively new to occupational health and safety, I reached out to the researchers. So several of them, especially ones at the Institute for Work and Health, which I think Maurice is a board member there, were incredibly helpful. I could go to somebody and say, okay, this is a really complex issue. What do you know about it? What do the researchers say? And was able to basically download a lot of really good science-based evidence about these sorts of things fairly quickly, and it was pretty useful. So I thought that was a pretty big success. More recently, as chief, or going back to my time as chief economist, housing isn't just an issue now. You think it's a big deal now? It's been a big deal almost forever. 2016-17, there was a big, really big run-up in housing prices, and this affordability thing was becoming a problem for the government then. Looking back from 2024, it doesn't look like such a big problem, but it really was then. We had some policy ideas, but I was looking around for some better ones because none of them were great. So I contacted people who work here at the University of Toronto. Over at the Rotman School, you have some of the best, smartest people in urban and housing economics. Will Strange, Nate Baum-Snow, Lou Hahn, a few other people in that department. It was just great to reach out, bounce some ideas off them, get their feedback, and I could turn that into some policy advice. And I think maybe one of the best things is something we never had to use. There was this president named Donald Trump, you might remember this, and he threatened to blow up our trade agreement with the United States, which was a big economic risk for the province of Ontario. And there was different scenarios about what would happen if NAFTA was just ripped up or what might replace it. So we needed to basically do two things. First of all, we had to figure out what the heck happens if someone rips up NAFTA. What does trade with the United States look like? That was hard to get at, but we were able to work with people in the economics department here using a global trade model to do some various scenarios to talk about who would get hit the hardest. Sometimes it wasn't who you thought, sometimes it was who you were. And what we were basically ready to do was say, okay, if the trade agreement kind of goes this way, or this way, here's who's going to get hit the most. And under that scenario, here maybe is some sensible policy advice about where the opportunities for the economy are and where the challenges are. So we had all that ready, and thankfully didn't have to use it because we still might. So my old department may be dusting off this work again. They may be using it soon, but fortunately we didn't have to use that. So there are a bunch of examples that I think worked. I would say, though, I wish we could have accessed academic researchers for more thinking more regularly. It was actually while there are elements of success, it was something I really felt like there were more opportunities to do that. And the one thing I would have liked to have seen more from the academic community when it came to the economy and economic policy was, I was being filmed, I wish they had called out the BS more. There's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about the economy and economic policy, and increasingly I think we're dealing with fake news and bad information out there, and I think today there's a real role for people who really understand the science and the data and the evidence, who have the, you know, and maybe there's a real trust problem, as Maurice said, but there's been a number of times I said, I just really wish someone who really understood this would speak out about it, who could. Instead, what you had is you had people who either had self-interested positions or partisan positions dominating the discussion about important public policy issues, and it wasn't being as informed as I think it could have been by academics who, at the very least, could have called out some fake news. But so, you know, some successes, but feeling it could have, I wish it worked a lot better.
So I think David wanted to add something.
Yeah, so just following up on your point about policy that has not worked, you know, we've been talking for the day and for this hour about policy development. But the sort of flip side of the coin is policy retreat, which is just as important as policy development. So there's a policy and it's in place, and for whatever reason it's been decided either by the politicians or the public service or the public that it's not working, or it's not working the way it was hoped. It's a real challenge to retreat from a policy. There are vested interests. There are politicians that have an interest in the policy going forward, politicians that have an interest in seeing the policy not go forward. Ditto for the public service. Ditto for the public. They want to see it go forward, they don't want to see it forward. So maybe we should talk a little bit about, in addition to policy development, what is the effective way or the challenges to beat a policy retreat, so that at the end of the day, the players in the policy, the politicians and the public servants and the public are not at each other's throats about it. Now, I would expect that Tom Axer there in the back has been down this debate many times over the years.
Never retreat. Sunset closes.
So I throw that out.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Big challenge. Actually, it is something I think policymakers, we develop, we put a decision forward. Oh, sorry. Yes, so in terms of policy, you're right. For the policy development piece, we develop, we put it forward, and I will say monitoring and evaluating on how did it do what we intended it to do once it's out in the real world and everything's shaking up and changing around it. It is an area that we continue to struggle with, I think. And I think working closely with academia on how we can actually do that better and have more of a feedback loop is an important area. And that would help with potentially having to change course or retreat or see where we could pivot if we were able to do that. Many times, you know, in my world, we get to the policy decision and we take it to the minister and the cabinet and we get the decision, and then it all goes into rollout, and then it's out in the world, and you know, we're on to, in my world, on to the next policy decision or another policy priority, and it may come back, they come back, but we lose that sort of, maybe we don't have a great line of sight on that time period of what happened while it was out there. Why are we looking at this back? So that is a great opportunity for research and policy to continue to collaborate on that. I would say in terms of success, one of the things that I think pandemic was a great experience of how people came together from a variety of disciplines. And I think the multidisciplinary way we can bring folks together to have that dialogue, I'd actually put on the table, it's not just me as a policy developer who's going to take advice up the chain and with the academia, but it's also with sector experts and community, where we can get them engaged as well, is where there are examples of really good successful collaboration, and it helps to anticipate the different angles and perspectives. And from sitting in my chair of policy, research is one information source. I'm looking at the evidence, we're looking at the team, we're looking at the evidence, but sharp policy would be where we can be very clear about the trade-offs between where the best available evidence is and say legal, economics, the fiscal, and which then goes up the chain to, the minister who's going to have conversations about on their side of things too, right? So I think that multidisciplinary perspective and diversity of perspective is really a key component of that.
So to address David's proposal about policy retreat, I agree. I think there is no reason to think that a piece of policy that was developed today should stay for 20 or 30 years in place and be effective. And so it would be more reasonable to me to say, certain policies come with a sunset clause expiry date of 10, 15, 20 years, whatever the case may be, where they need to be revised and seen whether they need to stay in the books or not, or modified. I wanted to go back to your original question about when things work well. Not so much because of cases that have worked well in my experience, although there are a few, but how it's so critical today because of all the challenges that we face, climate change, et cetera, in which the pandemic is put, emphasis on, that if we don't get this working right and working fast, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so there are some examples where science, policy, and public acceptance of those have worked well. Acid rain in Canada and the US is one example. Dealing with the ozone layer internationally is another example where, from discovery to action, it was a matter of 15, 20 years, and there was international acceptance. We need that kind of collaboration and quick address of policy issues to deal with climate change, to deal with ocean pollution, to deal with misinformation. But we don't seem to have these systems in place. And that's what I wonder, if some kind of institutionalized arrangement between academia and the political side and more contact with the public will help to deal with these issues. And it may be that some of these issues are of a different nature. They are viral in nature, not just the virus of COVID-19, but or the virus in the internet. But even there's just so many issues that are non-linear in their development, and we seem to be confused by that. And climate change is another case. The change in planetary atmospheres is highly non-linear. So I think we need to build on these successes of collaboration between academia and policy to be prepared for the many challenges that are before us.
Thank you for that. So in the keynote address, Glenn Jones talks about how, academics want their work to be cited or referenced. So what advice would you give to academics who wish to have a greater impact on public policy through their research and teaching? And I'll start with you, Maurice.
Easy question for me. Well, I think that an effort to deal with problems that are more real-life problems. I mean, in academia, oftentimes we deal with idealized problems because they're simpler to solve. In physics, you always look spherically symmetric problems. Well, reality is not spherically symmetric, and so you have to deal with actual problems. And so these are more difficult to deal with. Some of them are intractable, but I think some sort of concerted effort to deal with the big issues of our time, and they're not that many, but they're serious enough that they can render society almost helpless. And so AI, climate change, pollution, and some others, disinformation. So what can we do about this? Half a dozen problems in a concerted way.
what do you think, David, as someone who was a minister and also legislator?
I want to come back to something you said about we were talking about policy retreat, and you made the quite valid point that policies aren't meant to be here forever. So a policy that's 10 years old or 20 years old or 30 years, that's had a long life and it's outlived its usefulness, or times have changed, and I think everybody recognizes that, yes, times change, move on to something else. But the more challenging issue on this whole thing of policy retreat is when there's an immediate policy retreat. So there's been a policy implemented, and it's been out there for a couple of months, and it just didn't fly. And now everybody's gonna, how do we get from under this rock? And I have found in government that there can be so much embarrassment and recrimination and all of that sort of stuff that arises when there's been an immediate policy, or shortly after the policy was announced, it's pulled. And it's a real challenge for the developers of that policy, public servants, the politicians, perhaps the media, that how do people come out of that kind of immediate policy relief without a whole lot of embarrassment and recrimination and harm to the institutions of government?
With lots of difficulty.
So Anshoo, what do you think?
Lots of difficulty. Lots of difficulty, yes. There's many examples where I won't get into them that has happened, and part of it is, I would say, is how do you maintain what you raised, is the trust with the public, because you put the policy out there and it didn't have an outcome that you intended, or it had an unintended consequence that we didn't anticipate, which would be great to having more multidisciplinary testing your theories out, so you've at least surfaced the unintended consequences and you're going in it with eyes wide open, then we can manage that better. But when that happens, it's, I think, a key component to think about is how do you maintain that trust with the public, and how do we be transparent as possible. And maybe, actually, the pandemic gives lots of examples of where, it was being transparent about, this is the best available information we have right now, and based on this, we're going to do X, and that changed again. And there's constant dialogue with the public, and I think that was an example of difficult, but some trust and some success out of that, at least managing us through. We're all here, so.
I think nobody likes to be wrong or acknowledge that they're wrong, and so, but there is also an element of a lack of willingness to acknowledge that uncertainty is part of the game, and we don't really know where something is going to work or not until we try it. And so if there is more understanding of the uncertainty of a problem, maybe politicians and public servants and everybody involved is more humble about our really understanding of the depth of the problem, then it would be easier to ask for forgiveness when things don't go well. And I would say the worst case scenario is not when we realize right away there was a mistake. It's easier to pull something that has been on the books for 2 months, that a policy, I don't know, let's say for international students, housing, and that's been in the books for years, and the unintended consequences become apparent years down the road. And then you have to undo policies that have been in the books for a long time, and gets difficult. But it's necessary because we're not always going to get it right the first time.
So, Brian, would you like to comment on that, or the original question and advice to academics who want to shape policymaking through their work?
I'll go with the latter, or the sort of current discussion about policy retreats. I think the original comments about academic engagement, I just totally agreed with everything Maurice said, and I didn't have any value added anyway. So policy retreats, I think, are an interesting thing, and we've got some recent examples of it actually really close by. I spent some time this afternoon, and it'll be on the radio Monday morning talking about Bill 124, if anyone's interested.
Expensive retreat.
Expensive retreat. But I would say that's actually, in some ways, it's a financially difficult retreat, and maybe it's hard for people in politics to swallow who are in power currently, but at least I've seen some, I encouraged them at least a year ago to retreat from it, because you did this in 2019 when the world was different. And to the degree it might have made sense back then, and you can agree or disagree with it from a 2019 perspective, to any reasonable person it makes a lot less sense in 2024 after you've been through the pandemic, through the years of high inflation. And they found a way to, rather than go and fight the thing in court again, they found a way to actually repeal their own legislation. So that's a relatively good policy retreat from my perspective. Probably one of the worst ones I've seen in recent history would be the green belt and property development. I mean, that was one that was basically, forced on them by public opinion rather than changing circumstances. That was just, I think, a fiasco from a policy making perspective. And so, I guess what I learned from all that, to get back to the sort of question that is being raised, is it's really hard to retreat from something unless you can point to a reason why you did. And changing circumstances is a pretty good one, but if circumstances don't change, retreating is hard to do without admitting you made a mistake. And that can be that's harder. But people are suckers for apologies too, so. And sometimes it really does work. So, don't be afraid to do that would be my advice. Just learn how to do it well, because you probably will.
So we have a few students here. So this next question is for them. What advice would you give to our graduate students who want to enter a career in policymaking? Are there certain skills that they need, or are there certain areas of research they should hone in? Like, what advice would you have for them? I'll start with Anshoo, since she has a very illustrious career in policy.
What advice would I give? Well, I will say just my own career. I went to business school, and then I ended up in government. It wasn't really planned, but it's been great. I would say, in terms of advice, is forums like this, dialogue. If you're in the research world, I think an area we could continue to strengthen, and we have that, is those study work internships. I mean, those are great ways we bring in folks and we get that discipline, experience and expertise of folks that are bringing that research background, and you get exposure to the inner workings of that ministry and what they're working on. And all those things and so that's a great opportunity to continue to build those relationships with the faculties and continue to do that. The other piece I will speak to, as Brian spoke to, that one-page briefing note, in terms of a skill, is plain language writing. As Minister spoke to, we spend writing and how we write and how we communicate to the audience is really critical, and it's very different from academia. So one-page briefing note, plain language, and it's hard. It's very hard to take very complex ideas and context and nuance and then trying to distill that to the decision maker in a way that they can feel confident and have that trust in it as well. So that would be an area I would say continue to work on.
Brian, as someone who is trying to instill these skills in your students, what advice do you have?
Yeah, I think that the students who come out of our program have an amazing skill set. They've all come to our programs with undergraduate, graduate, sometimes multiple graduate degrees in other things already. So they have some super strong sort of academic grounding and skills. So your job is really to build on that. And don't lose sight, by the way, of what economic theory or political science theory or engineering theory would say in a problem. You should actually think about that a lot of the time. It's just that you would communicate it a little bit differently than using calculus or graphs or really long papers, but you can communicate those ideas, and just think about how you would communicate them. So I totally agree that the communication skills are important. My professional career advice, of which I think I have a half-hour slide deck somewhere, I'll just give you the highlights of that. The most important rule is you're responsible for your own career. I did actually a fairly terrible job managing my career. I just ended up in a great job, which despite my lack of interest in my own career. So, you know, maybe that's will work out for me, but I don't advise it. You know, like, make sure you're doing the right things, that you are, you know, learning from your jobs, that you are getting new experiences, that you're delivering the products and you're developing good relationships. All of those things are key, but you have to make those kind of steps to do that in a sort of an informed way. Make sure you're getting feedback. You might be working with or for people who hate to tell you how you're doing. I worked for some who were very glad to tell me how I was doing, especially when I wasn't doing very well. But you know, you might need to get feedback about what am I doing well, what could I do better, and stuff like that. And maybe the last and most important thing is be curious. You know, you know a lot, but none of us knows everything. So when you're addressing a public policy issue, make sure that you access as much information and different perspectives. When you're going to a minister for approval about something, make sure all the perspectives are on the table so that they're making an informed decision. You know, like, and so, you know, your curiosity about what other people think about a problem is just as important as what your own opinion is, and make sure you get all that on the paper. That'd be maybe my final one.
David, what do you think?
Oh, well, so someone who sat in the boardroom table on one side of the table with the senior public service on the other side of the table briefing me, a couple of things jump out. To your point, presentation skills, just simple presentation skills, you know, to articulate, get to the point, make the point simple. And I don't mean make the point simple in the sense that you don't think the person can understand, but, you know, clarity and all of those sorts of things. You know, I'm not telling tales out of school and so on, but with my minister colleagues, you know, we chat amongst ourselves, different briefings from different people, and the ministers always had their sort of favorite briefers, or briefers that they preferred. And you know, the commonality there was clarity, conciseness, to the point, not patronizing. That was a very important one, because sometimes there was a tendency, you know, I'm very sympathetic if you're dealing with a dumb minister, how you can end up patronizing. It's just kind of a natural thing, and I don't mean any disrespect, but that's a reality. But, you know, strike that balance, clarity, not patronizing, all of those sorts of things. And in many ways, some of the, there was someone in the ministry that I was in who was struggling with some presentation skills. The substance was there. The substance was there. But it was the presenting the substance. And that person went to one of these theater schools here in Toronto, or, you know, voice coaches and all of that stuff, and developed really nice, you know, clear speaking skills, and just those sort of basics which changed the whole tone of the presentation. And that person, I can say now, has gone on to be one of the real good briefers. Wow. I mean, that's real getting down to nuts and bolts stuff, but imagine, you know, the students here that have to give a presentation at Massey, and some people, you know, are nervous and perhaps they mumble, and this, that, and it affects the presentation. It affects how the recommendation is being received.
That's really, really good advice, and it's so important. So you need to build your reputation on somebody who knows his or her stuff, that you've done the homework, right? That you can explain it clearly, you're a good brief, and you present your materials on time. And people will start asking for somebody, you know, who can present something clearly and is comprehensive, and that's good research. So that's really important. So that aspect of communication. So I would say kind of three legs to this. One is communication, both written and oral. If you can speak better than most people and write better than most people, you certainly do better than most people in this environment or another. Another one is your solid research. You have to you know your subject matter well. You have to have looked at all the different angles and present it in a fair and biased way. And the third one is one of acuity, both of the political environment in which the minister has to make the decision, and also reading the room, understanding. The minister may say, okay, we had half an hour, but there is a vote in the House, so walk with me and tell me in a minute and a half what you know about this. And you need to be prepared to give the essential things in a minute and a half. You cannot start thinking about it at that point. You have to have this prepared beforehand, right?
This is I wish I collected the data, but the number of times I asked a minister whether they wanted me to walk through the deck or give them the highlights. Do you want to guess what the probabilities were on that statement? It'd be close to 100% on the give me the highlights. Not 100. Occasionally they'd want the whole story, but not usually. They just want the highlights.
But also understanding how some people are readers. Some people want to listen to the story. If the people are readers, you have to present the information ahead of time so they have a chance to read it. And then they'll have just questions and you deal with that. Some people want to hear the story from A to B. It's just they process information in a different way. And you need to adapt yourself to that. So it's a matter of people skills, acuity in the briefing room, but also in the political situation. If the minister is in the last page, he or she is already done with it, you need to move on. Right? So that kind of understanding of the situation you're in is really important.
There must surely be a book out, The Art of Briefing. I don't know. Is there?
I don't think there is. Maybe we should write it. Yeah.
The Art of Briefing.
Yeah.
I've got some good videos about how not to do it.
But I also think that I feel like there's a certain art of briefing specifically that is like, it's Canada specific or Ontario specific, because there's certain ways of even writing briefing notes. I remember we had a class with Drew Fagan, and I asked him if the way that he was telling us how to write these briefing notes, it was specific to how, the Ontario government prefers them. So I wonder if it's the same for briefing or if it's universal way of doing it.
It really varies from person to person and what their needs are. So the style and content of briefing an assistant deputy minister versus a deputy minister versus a minister is inherently different because they have different roles to play, along the way. But anytime you have to move something through a system of there's multiple people, they have different preferences, they have different interests, they have different ways of looking at things. As Maurice pointed out, some people really want to get it in advance and read it. And they'll just come in armed with questions. And those are actually the best briefings because they've had a chance to think about it. And you write that material differently than you might write something that you're going to walk somebody through in person. Others, they won't have the opportunity to do that because ministers are incredibly busy people. And what you're sitting there talking about is the thing you work on 24/7. This is your thing. And I'd be conscious of this when I was briefing a finance minister. I'd be coming to talk about the economy. But the finance minister has to think about, how's the overall finances working? How much money are we borrowing? Why are people mad about their auto insurance? How many cannabis stores are open? And on and on and on. The number of things a finance minister has to think about in any given day. I don't know how they do the job. You have to be respectful about how hard that is and adjust to their style. And I've had the privilege of working for several finance ministers and 3 labor ministers, and they all have their own style. And as was said earlier, learn their style. What are their needs? How do they actually prefer to consume information? It's one of the first questions we want to know about a minister is how do they like to be briefed? Because it does vary, right? So just learn your audience and also read the room, just because that's, they all have their better and worse days. Some days, they might have attention for something. They might be distracted because they're, okay, right after this I got to go out and I'm going to get beaten up by the press about this, and that's what's really on my mind. So you got to kind of read the room sometimes and know how to help them. Be as helpful as possible in all those circumstances. And those are skills that you can learn as public servants. And frankly, they're not skills that you're really great at because I was an academic. It's not here. You're totally fine standing in front of 100 students and boring them to death for 3 hours. It's almost your job. But you don't do that when you're actually like working in public service. You have to be very, very conscious of your audience. You should be when you teach, but you really have to be when you do public policy briefings.
So I'll just have one last question and then we can open it up to the audience. When drafting public policies, how much weight did you give to academic research on that subject, given that there are so many diverse perspectives that have to go into policy making? And I'll start with Maurice.
I would say the answer is depends. And policies are made in different ways with different ways of knowledge, values, but we don't talk a lot about values, but a lot of the policies that are made are based on values and timeliness and the need to act quickly. And so there's some policies that are very heavily based on the need to act quickly and the values, and they have very little information of actual academic research, or maybe there isn't a lot in that area. Well, others, they come to the fore through research, and so they're more heavily based on research. So my bias is always to try to base the policies as much as possible on what is known, understanding that because of the nature of scientific knowledge, that's going to be changing, and so there's an uncertainty built into that. But oftentimes, we are not aware to what extent our values as society are driving the policies that we develop. And I think it's interesting to put it on the table so we just know, on what basis we're developing the policy.
Yeah, so what kind of research does a politician look for in a briefing? Well, the politician doesn't have the skill set to go and access the various bodies of research and what's around. He or she just doesn't know that. But what the minister will expect is that the policy presenter or the researcher has laid before him or her what he needs or she needs to know to make an informed decision. And that circles back to this idea of trust. Can I trust, can the politician trust that you've told me the essentials of what I need to make the decision? And if you have a bias, and everybody has bias, have you accounted for your bias? Have you set it aside, so to speak? Can I trust what you are telling me?
Got my own. So to pick up on that, and how this question becomes about how do you build that trust between the policy advisors who are going in to brief the minister, and how we use research. So I agree, context matters, the issue matters, and where you are in the policy development process matters too. So that will shake out. But I think the focus we would have at the end of the day is being aware of the best available research and knowing the interactions. As I said, it's one input. There's values. There's the fiscal situation. There's whatever legal issue is at place, and there's timing. So if we can, as policy advisors, be transparent and clear about what those trade-offs are, what the research has said, there's these other factors, minister, these are the trade-offs, this is what we know, and also being clear about this is what we don't know. These are gaps. And a piece that I think is something that we're being much more aware of now is who is that research reflecting? Who are the people that aren't captured here? Who are we talking about? What factors haven't been accounted for? And I think as good policy is aware of that and transparent about that and can articulate that to the decision makers so they're aware of what they're working towards and what decision they're making.
Yeah, the part about saying when you don't know, it's really important. If you don't know, don't try to, skate.
What would I add to all of that? I think it's important that they know. I think ultimately I've had to provide, had the privilege of providing advice on a wide range of issues, and it's important for them to know what academic research says. A lot of our job goes down to the communications that was talked about earlier. The minister's not going to go off and, well, if I've ever had a minister go read some academic journals, good on them. I don't, but good on them. My staff, I hope, did. They have to be aware, right? They really need to be aware that the preponderance of the evidence, like for example, minimum wage is a policy that came up a lot while I was chief economist. So we felt we needed to warn every government that wanted to raise a minimum wage that there was some academic research that said there were going to be adverse employment impacts to that, and they should at least know that research is out there. And then what we could do is tell the story about why the research says that, and maybe explain why under other circumstances that may or may not happen to the extent that the research says. So, you know, we were able to add some color, and I think some current context to that, add some value to that, but they need to know it's there, and, and that's all part of making informed decisions. And what you'll often find is academic research points to different kinds of conclusions, and then your job is to summarize, okay, if you believe the world works this way, this is what you get, and if you think it works more like this, then you'll get that. So sometimes these researchers just start off with different points in time, different databases. So you need to give that incredible amount of knowledge relevance and context, and it does kind of come back around to Maurice's point about, you know, we don't know that study is exactly what's going to happen when you do this policy, but this is what we know. What we don't know is how it might work today, and so there's risks around it and things like that. So I think that's my view about how we approach it.
Okay, well, I think that we can start with some questions from the audience. Thank you so much, by the way, everybody.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about communication. You said that we should communicate in a way that it is understandable for them. In other words, we should simplify, in other words, or maybe something else. But is there any possibility that oversimplification leads to a miscommunication, that the decision makers expect something and the scientists or academics, on the other hand, or policymakers, they want to communicate something, but they expect something else because of the oversimplification? And the other question may be related to Mr. Lewis about data analysis. For academics to develop evidence-based policies and help decision makers, that sometimes they need to do data analysis. And many academics might not have access to some data, which is, you know, like in labor markets or in health-related or economic departments. How do you see that as a challenge, and what can be done to resolve this problem?
Maybe I'll take the first one and I'll give you the data, Brian. There is an important difference between abstracting the essential characteristic of a problem on which a decision will turn to oversimplifying and dumbing down. And this is really, really important. What we're after is the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So as a policy analyst, you have to go through the complexity. You have to understand it deeply. You have to be able to abstract the key things on which a decision might turn. And then you have to present that clearly. And then the minister has to have the confidence that you've done your homework, and really there's not going to be a surprise. And this is not a dumbing down of the issue, but really an abstraction of the essential characteristics of the issue.
And my experience is, again, so on the one-page briefing, it's highlighted the points, given the essential facts. And just as important, it has whetted the minister's appetite to understand. And if there are some gaps in the understanding or some uncertainty, a good minister will start to probe a little bit. And that probe may lead to a further briefing or additional briefing or a more complex briefing. But the initial briefing note is to get the ball rolling, if you will.
Or if you're presenting a deck, you might have that kind of stuff in an appendix. So if the discussion goes to certain specifics, yeah, it's an appendix 5 in all detail, but you don't have the time to present it in the first briefing.
I would just add to that before you get to the minister, you've gone through layers of briefings, right? And to that point, that's helped you take that complexity to the other side of simplicity. And it's about what does that decision maker need to know at that time to turn that decision? So it's not we're going to pretend like complexity doesn't exist or get so simple. And this is why plain language is very hard. It's how do you communicate it to the right level of information to that decision maker, and that changes as you go from the director to the ADM to the deputy to the minister, right?
I knew a minister whose opening line was at some of the briefings, if they were not clear enough, he would say, with a sense of humor, you know, nobody was offended, he'd say, "Oh, you've been reading too many of those academic journals."
I doubt that was true of anybody sitting across from. It might have been true of some of their staff. Depends on the minister, I guess, and his team. Great point about data. Something I felt and feel very passionately about is you know, the principle, and I think it's the right one, is if we make data available to smart people, they will help us draw inference from us, help us solve our problems. I actually totally believe in that, and tried to make that as real as possible. I never got to the point where I was successful. There's actually a good success model, which is your ministry, which, thanks to the efforts of one of my colleagues, got Ontario social assistance data de-identified into the StatsCan data center, so academics who have access to the research data center across the country can get that data, do research, you know, link the data to other things, and do really cool things with it. I'm not close enough to it to know what we've learned about Ontario social assistance planning and policy from it, but that was a very cool thing, and it was very inspiring. So there's the principle side, and I think that's the right side to pursue. I'd be naive not to point out there's a practical side, where when I pitched this idea to somebody, they sort of said, you know, Brian, they're just going to use our data against us. I go, well, you can't help that. I mean, if you're going to learn from it and you're going to put it out there, people might do it. But that's where I think the academic community comes in handy, is because if they're doing their jobs well and they're being objective and they're testing hypotheses with the best data, the research is the research, and those are the facts that you can make recommendations on. And if other people are bending data to use to make inappropriate conclusions, which I think some people in my particular line of work are very talented at doing, you know, they get advised and dismissed accordingly, and hopefully it doesn't really matter, but it does happen. But I think the big obstacles, I think there's a big global sort of issue out there about privacy, like, and that's really a hard nut to crack. And you can couple that with the lack of trust in government that we have right now. It makes it a doubly tough nut to crack. And I think, you know, good people working in like privacy policy, which I was talking to someone about this actually yesterday, you know, are trying to sort of weave all this together with the right safeguards in place. But there's always a trade-off there. The safest possible way to keep, you know, the best possible way to keep data safe is not let anyone ever see it. We had a deal with StatsCan once that we could have their data, but we couldn't put it on a computer. We put it on a computer, but it couldn't have a printer or a monitor or something absurd like that. Like, couldn't really use it. The other obstacle is legislation. You know, a lot of data is collected under old statutes, and it makes it really, you know, and they weren't written understanding the capacity that we have today. Again, an anecdote I have from my time at the Labor Ministry, part of my job was to bring together all the data, integrate data on the occupational health and safety system, make it available to researchers, mine it ourselves for inference. And it didn't take me long into the job till somebody from the legal department pointed out that I can't actually manage the data. The legislation said only certain people can manage the data. I wasn't one of them, my team wasn't one of them, we didn't have the rights. So, now that act was written in 1979. It didn't anticipate that in 2012, that we could do certain things with it. So there's a lot of sort of work that needs to be done to unleash the access to that data. That work is being done, but it's tough. And I think in the end that some of those the public trust and big government concerns that are deeper now than they were even 5 years ago are really going to be an impediment.
Hi, panelists and professors. I also want to ask about communication, but to the public, and specifically I want to ask about knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation. Because I think for, you know, academic researchers and scholars, if we do better job at communicating the knowledge to the public, it will make the society more resilient against misinformation or against something like populism, right? So I wonder, how do we do better at that? So the knowledge that we study and research on is not just responsible to politicians, but also to, say, a regular Canadian that scrolls on their phone to find information. Yeah, that's.
Well, that's a very good question, because I made a note to myself here about the challenges of developing policy in this hyper in this age of hyper-partisanship. And I can remember a time, a generation ago, governments articulated policy, and for the most part, people viewed the policy and they said, well, I understand that, and you know, I understand this, I think that's not bad. This aspect of it, I think is, you know, don't really understand that, don't think I'm in favor of that, but there was nuance, and there was room to sort of move around within the policy and discuss it. Now, my sense is a policy proposal gets out into the public, and by definition, a segment of the public says it's wrong, period, no, end of story. Don't want to talk about it. And the other segment in the public, that's the right policy, and I don't want to listen to any arguments why it might be something else. So therein is a challenge. If policy development and policy presentation is a kind of a living document, if you will, where you adjust it and fine-tune it and massage it and all of that sort of stuff, how do you do that when people say, you're wrong, you're right, and there's no in-between?
Yeah, I don't know that I'll be able to answer that. But I would say that beyond that polarization, there is also a lack of tools for people to engage. For example, if a student is not interested in science in high school, he can drop science in grade 10. What hope do we have that that person as a citizen will be able to understand the nuances of some, you know, policy on genomics, you know, with that kind of training in science? I don't know what happened with the, I wasn't educated here, so I don't know, but we used to have civic education classes in high school. Have to learn how government works, have to learn how, you know, policies are made. I don't think my kids had that kind of education. Rhetoric, how to make an argument, how to be able to engage in public communication, public discussion. That's not taught either. So I think that we need to make efforts in all these areas. I think that the universities are placed in a unique position to be able to have arguments and listen to the other side, kind of show the way how you can argue an issue with different sides with respect for the other person's position. And maybe to the extent that we can show that and model that to society, that will find a way so people don't just reject arguments offhandedly. But it's a really difficult problem. It's also, I think, coupled with kind of the evaluation of expertise that we're observing in our society. And I think this is kind of the flip side of the democratization of knowledge. There's an incredible development, is the democratization of knowledge. Everybody has access to all the knowledge created in humanity through your phone. This never happened before. The printing press is but a pale comparison to what this is, and we haven't seen the effects of this yet. But at the same time, it gives in some sectors the idea is that I don't need you, I don't need an expert, I just Google the stuff myself. Well, but there is a role for expertise, right? If you want a deep answer on the subject, you need expert knowledge about it. So this thing about the evolution of expertise and polarization, it's really problematic for any society to be able to do policy or to be able to do anything else. And like I said before, I think universities can play a role in being those spaces where those conversations can take place.
And I'll just jump on top of that, Nada. I think that's incredibly important for universities to try to do. You know, I see universities as an enormous societal resource. We have, you know, smart people with doing interesting research, have the ability to also educate bright young minds who are going to go out there and do good work in the private sector or the public sector somewhere. I see the enormous value there. But when you're here, you don't really feel you need to demonstrate the value, and there, you know, and I think it's always good to sort of demonstrate your value proposition out there, and if it's weighing in on public policy, it's providing evidence, it's helping governments deal with today's problems. That's part of the value proposition, and I mean, I really encourage universities to do this because I'm not sure they appreciate the potential challenges that may be coming their way. to be incredibly blunt about this in the current political environment. I mean, universities, for all their benefits, are incredibly elitist institutions. Weigh that up against the wave of populism. This could be really, really bad for universities and post-secondary education institutions that don't, try to be insular and try not to engage. I think there could be real problems there. We're seeing little snippets of it with provincial post-secondary education policy. It could get a lot worse, and I really, really worry about, not responding to the sort of changing world out there and providing that kind of value and the kind of insight that would actually help. I think it's not a time to kind of retreat back. I think it's a time to be a little more forthcoming and engage more and say more useful things.
Can I jump on that a little bit, not to beat up on academia or universities, but what you said remind me of something. I spent reading week in Spain. I was invited to give a talk at the University of Salamanca. The University of Salamanca was founded in 1218. It's been around for 800 years. It's the fourth oldest in Europe, the oldest one in Spain. And I went to visit the classroom where Fray Luis de León taught. He's a very famous Spanish priest, but also a writer, poet, etc. And allowing for the difference in construction, the room looks exactly like this. It was a pulpit at the front and rows of seats. And I wonder, it's been 800 years, should we still be teaching the same way? We know now so much more about cognitive ways of learning and cognitive plasticity, etc. Is there a better way to engage with our students to be able to teach and learn and develop? So I just throw it out there as a university is perhaps the only institution that somebody time traveling from 1,000 years ago would recognize today.
I'm just going to remind myself, there's one thing I forgot to say. I think the Monk School actually does that engagement really well. I'm not, one of the things that's great about being at Monk is the regular ongoing engagement of the people in our department in, whether it's global affairs issues and hearing some of the great people on that side of the department speak about it, or the public policy people. I think we're a really good place for, in the academic environment to build those bridges and to make that kind of value proposition. So, there are other departments that are not nearly that far along that same sort of path we do here at Monk, which I think is important to recognize that I think we're a success story about how a good university department can engage positively in today's important debates, and that's why it's great to be here.
Thank you. A couple of things that I found your candid discussion of policy retreat, you called it, really interesting and refreshing to hear about. Is that the same as failed policy? And if it is what happens internally? Is there, who's accountable for when that happens for failed policies? Is there some kind of look back internally to see, hey, how did we make this decision, or did we go wrong in our information or our communication, or what? What's that process like internally, if there is one? And secondly, why do some of you or all of you think that some of our most, I'm sorry, why do some or all of you think, what is your perspective on why some of our most serious problems seem to be impervious to any kind of policy success? And this came to me from your comments about climate change, and just how is it that we have all of these great elements that we're talking about here, and yet a lot of really smart people have tried to craft policy that so far have not provided the answers that the outcomes have sought?
Well, on the policy retreat question, so often behind the scenes in the privacy of the cabinet room, particularly, as Tom will know, in a minister's only, where there are no public servants, it's just a minister and they speak frankly, there's a finger-pointing exercise. Okay? And then they get past that after a while. Not always but sometimes a finger-pointing exercise. And then what should follow, and for the most part does follow, is a very constructive and honest way of analyzing why there should be a policy retreat. Part of that is, why didn't it work? And it may have been working, it just may be a pure change of policy. Not that the policy wasn't working, but that policy's old now, we have a new one. So I think with thoughtful politicians and thoughtful civil servants, that sort of strategic retreat can be achieved.
I think policies can fail for many reasons. They can be political reasons, policy reasons, execution reasons, and they generally are analyzed, you know, in the bureaucracy side of things, not for the political fallout, which would have been discussed, you know, in the cabinet table, but for how we can do better next time. So there is an exercise to do that. Respecting your other question, why can we get this done? I wasn't meaning to be so negative, but that's why I pointed to a couple of things that we've done right, like acid rain and the hole in the ozone layer, to show the way that we can do this. But for whatever, probably a series of complex reasons, we haven't been able to with climate change. Maybe we are so, you know, so used to using hydrocarbon fuels that we cannot really part with them in a meaningful way to make a dent. And maybe this is a change that should have been planned for 40, 50 years, you know, because that's the time that would take for the new technologies to come on stream, and we wanted to do it right away, and maybe that was part of it. Maybe because this climate change is such a non-linear process that nothing happened for many years, and now we're seeing the consequences of it. Who knows? It's a complex thing. But my point for bringing that to discussion is that we can deal with this. We can solve it if we get our act together about, you know, having the trust between the public, the academia, and the politicians.
Yeah, we have. I think it's good to focus on the problems we still need to solve. I think that's constructive and healthy. But yeah, we have solved a lot of problems, and I think that's a really important point, Maurice. I always wondered how the blame allocation exercise worked, so that was really insightful. I think there's a reality of whether you're in the political side or the public service side is there's a bit of the messenger or the minister of the day is the one who kind of gets shot with the blame. I'll give you a few current examples. It's neither it's not the current federal minister of immigration, nor is it the current provincial minister of colleges and universities that created this mess with student permits and colleges and things like that. They're both dealing with it, and they're both taking a lot of flack for it because it needs to be dealt with. I would say it's not the fault of the federal procurement minister that what happened with ArriveCan. I think some public servants really failed there. The minister has to be accountable for what happens in their ministry. Our system relies on that critically, but probably one of my great fears as a public servant is I would do anything that would actually hurt the minister. Like, it's our job to support the government at the end of the day. Give your fearless advice, but faithfully implement, and don't create problems for them. And there's a certain part of it that's just part of the job. You could be right place, right time, or wrong place, wrong time, and it's how you deal with that. And that's you'd rather not be the one leading the retreat, frankly, because those are hard. But it might be your job to lead the retreat, and you know, hopefully we used to have this other phrase called "live to fight another day," which can be good practical advice when you're maybe leading a retreat.
Could I just add a couple of things there? I did want to say the word failure. As we said, context changes, depends on when the retreat is. Is it a failure or reality, or for what fit for purpose changed, right? So on that front, I did say from the public servant perspective, it is a government decision also to reverse a policy. So just as the process to get to that policy decision, the policy development process, going through all of the decision-making layers, taking it in front of cabinet for them to deliberate after they've done the finger pointing, it would be the same on that side. So in that, you are then looking through the process and what went wrong, where was there information missed, all those pieces. So it is still a process, and it would be a cabinet decision that goes back to cabinet to do that, and in that the public servants would do all the work up back then, sometimes very quickly, but they would go through that route again. And sometimes it's staged, right? Sometimes you have to do it through multiple iterations. So just wanted to add that point as well.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our panel. Could everyone just join me in thanking our esteemed panelists?
Clap for the audience. Clap for the audience. I'm sure that for the students here, I hope you've learned, picked up a few ideas on how to become a really good policy developer and a really good policy presenter. The two go hand in hand.
Policy retreater.
Yes.
Hopefully not too much.
I suddenly want to be a specialist in that.